Hello, and welcome to the Rules of the Game podcast, where it is my job to discuss democratic institutions. There are, broadly speaking, two forms of government, parliamentarism and presidentialism. The main difference is that in a parliamentary system, the government depends on the support of parliament, the confidence of parliament, and it is also accountable to that parliament. While a president in a presidential system is elected by the people for a fixed term and does not depend on parliament, but is mainly accountable to the people. Examples of parliamentary systems are the United Kingdom, Germany, or South Africa. Examples of presidential systems are the United States, Nigeria, Brazil, or Chile. My guest in this episode of the Rules of the Game podcast is Tiago Santos, who has written the book titled Why Not Parliamentarism? He is convinced that parliamentarism is the superior form of government and describes his arguments in the book in detail. While it is nearly impossible to make a causal argument in this regard, plenty of statistics in the book show that parliamentary systems perform really well in welfare terms. Together, we discuss what are the important differences between the two systems, what are possible advantages and disadvantages, and about his opinion on whether the electoral law, for instance proportional representation, matters when it comes to the well-functioning of the government system. We strongly agreed on the point that the discussion of this subject matter should be way more public and prominent across the globe. Tiago's motivation to write the book was first of all to contribute to that public discussion. Parliamentarism and the form of government is also pretty much absent in development economics or economic growth research, even though it seems to make such a big difference. Tiago Santos has been a Brazilian career diplomat since 2007 and has worked at the World Bank until quite recently. He has a law degree from Pontificia Universidade Católica in Rio de Janeiro, a professional degree from Instituto Rio Branco, Brazil's National Diplomatic Academy, and a master's degree from the University of Chicago, Harris School of Public Policy. None of the opinions here or in the book reflect the views of any institution he has been associated with. I am your host, Stefan Keiberts, and this is the latest episode of my podcast, The Rules of the Game. I am a political economist with a PhD in economics from the University of Bern in Switzerland, and I previously held positions at the London School of Economics and Political Science and the Center for Global Development. You find a full transcript of the conversation on my website, rulesofthegame.blog. If you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your preferred podcast platform and share it with friends and colleagues. Now please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Tiago Santos. Tiago Santos, very welcome to the Rules of the Game podcast. I'm very happy to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So as usually, I start with the first question that I pose to all my guests. What is your first memory of democracy?
That's a great question. I have to say my first memory of democracy was when I was 8 years old. It was the first presidential campaign in Brazil. My parents were very engaged politically, so they took me to a rally. And I thought it was a beautiful thing. Brazil was coming out of a 20-year dictatorship, and this was the first presidential elections in a very long time. And everybody was just very, very thrilled with the idea of being able to vote and having democracy back again. So it's a very fond memory.
Cool. Yeah, that's a very beautiful memory. And that was pretty much in the 80s, right?
1989.
Oh, the first election was 1989 then. Yeah, okay, yeah, sure. And did that in any way kind of push your motivation, or where does your motivation to write your book, Why Not Parliamentarism? What created this motivation to write that book?
So actually, not. I was always a kid that was very engaged politically. I was always interested since that day, and during my teenage years, I was always very interested in political issues. But the motivation for the book is much more recent. I talk about this a little bit in the book itself. So when I joined as an advisor at the board of directors at the World Bank, my former boss back then, Otaviano Canuto, invited me to write an article on the economic effects of the Brazilian constitution. And then I would research all these things that could affect the Brazilian economy because of the constitution that we had. And then one inescapable aspect was that, well, Brazil has a presidential constitution, and so many other countries have a different one. And I started doing research on this, and it became very large already, so it would not fit the article. And I just was so dumbfounded by the effects, the amount of evidence that I was finding, and the many research areas from political science and economics and history that would point to this direction that I felt a somewhat of a responsibility to write it. I thought that this is something that, for the amount of evidence that we have, for the size of the effects that we are talking about, that we do not have nearly as many people talking about it as we should. So I see myself as a person that's trying to only make the issues more known. I'm not a very original in my book. I try to take as much from research from others as possible. So that was it. I was thinking that the world not only was missing out on an opportunity to significantly improve people's lives, but as I became more convinced that we are also seeing a phenomenon that Pogumti and Webb, those names are hard to say, talk about the presidentialization of politics. So we are seeing that we are moving further away from the idea of parliamentarism. So I thought that someone should sound the alarm.
I think the book is very interesting. It's very nice to read because you bring in a lot of different aspects around this question. And I think your motivation to write the book was probably quite similar to my motivation to start this podcast, because I always thought, like, in somehow we already know a lot. We know a lot about institutions. Maybe we don't know so much about the evolution of institutions and kind of these critical junctures and how we bring about institutional change. But we kind of know a lot about, which institutions are more successful than others, or which institutions bring more balance into the political system. And I think that's really a central question. And also, we can come back to the question of, why don't we see more of this discussion? But first, maybe for the listeners, can you quickly recap in what's, in your opinion, kind of what are the main characteristics of parliamentarism compared to presidentialism, and what are, like, your main arguments why parliamentarism is the better form of government?
All right. So I like that you asked my opinion because there are different definitions of parliamentarism. The one that I use is, I think, a very broad one, and I think it's pretty well defined. Is executive subordination to the legislature. So if you have elements of that, any characteristic that means some more subordination of the executive to the legislature, it means that the country is more parliamentarist, and then there's less of it. So there are gradations. There's a continuum between parliamentarism and presidentialism, but you also can speak meaningfully of a presidential country and a parliamentary country because these characteristics tend to lump together. This is not as widely shared as I would hope. There are some people that are much more strict. So you have thinkers like Sheibu that thinks that the confidence procedure is the main characteristic of parliamentarism, is the defining issue. I disagree with that view. I think that, for example, the choice of the head of the executive by the legislature is as important as that. So there are different definitions. I think that mine is pretty broad and meaningful enough, and I like it. So you were asking what the benefits are, right? We're
Yeah, or
onto
kind of
that
what
already.
makes you believe or think, why is parliamentarism better? Like, what are kind of the main, empirical results maybe that we know, or
Yeah.
how do you derive your opinion on that?
So there's this political scientist on Twitter, Marko Pilovic, who says that everything is in lens, one lens. The rest is commentary. So it's a joke with the Talmud, and I think that he's onto something. I think that the main arguments are already there, and what we have now, and we're going to get to, is a lot more evidence. So I think we should start with Linz's argument, which is that presidentialism has many perils, has many failures that parliamentarism does not have, and still can keep the democratic nature. So the first one is the dual legitimacy. There is a legitimacy that the president has and the legitimacy of the parliament, and they both can claim truly that they represent the whole of the people. And this means that there is no systematic way for us to sort who is above the other, and then they will fight. They will use that. They will charge the people against one or the other, and this means that the politics becomes a lot more dysfunctional because of this aspect. The other thing is that the winner take all aspect of it. So if you have parliamentary elections, even if there's a party that's majoritarian, there's enough differences between the members of parliament that there's always going to have to be some negotiation, a lot of negotiation, for the positions to be pushed through. Whereas, by its very nature, presidentialism holds all the presidential powers, which is a lot of power, in the hands of a single person. And this means that not only will you want your group to achieve the presidency because of all the benefits that are associated with that, but you really don't want to be in the group that loses the presidential elections, because there's so much harm that derives from that to your group. So um, polarization increases dramatically, because you only have the incentive to win the presidency, and then everything will be sorted out. You don't have to negotiate with the other groups anymore. You're sort of out of the risk. So that's a very important one. You have the
And
rigidity. Yeah.
and also maybe one, just to chip in here quickly, also the presidential government is much more hierarchical usually than the parliamentary, right? If you have, like, parliamentarism usually has a more collegial kind of coalition government, and the coalition kind of works on solutions, like legislative solutions, while in presidential systems we have more a strong hierarchy. So we have a president who has kind of a lot of power just vested in his office, and that usually appoints the whole cabinet, right? And also, I mean, a lot of cabinet positions in the US, for example, still need to be confirmed by the Senate, right? But in many other countries, the presidential appointments are pretty much secured. So the president has a lot of power. So, as I also from your book, as you write, the US presidential system is actually not even one of the very representative system in terms of how much power is vested in the president, because in the US system, the Congress still is kind of a strong check on the president, while in other presidential systems, the president has even more power in his office. Would you agree to that?
No, no, completely. So the Congress in the U.S. has historically a lot of power. Still has a lot more power than the typical Congress in a Latin America or African country continents that have a lot of presidential uh, uh, constitutions. And for example, as you said, the confirmation thing, the power over the purse, the power of the purse that the Congress has in the U.S. is not the same as many Latin American countries. Other appointments to public companies, and even Woodrow Wilson, the first PhD with a political science PhD that became president, called the system that the U.S. has congressional government. So you even have on that a very different aspect than what uh, um, Simon Bolivar, the person responsible for the independence of many Latin American countries, said that we would have elected kings with the name of presidents in Latin America. And when he said kings, he meant kings before parliamentarism, the kings that had a lot of power. So think that you have a Louis XIV in each Latin American country, and that happens to be elected, but many of the pairs are the same. So you're absolutely right that the U.S. has a very atypical presidential system.
And you mentioned the rigidity. What did you like just before I
Oh yes.
interrupted you? What was that thought?
So it's also part of Lynn's thesis that you have a problem of rigidity in presidential systems. So in Germany, for example, Angela Merkel is considered a very good prime minister. She can stay there for many years and not be considered a threat to democracy because of all the the, the, the benefits of parliamentarism, that they can remove her at any time if they want. So she was in Germany. She led Germany for many years. Whereas in presidential systems, you will always have some limit to re-election, because if you don't have a limit to re-election, the president will naturally accumulate so much power over him that he will never leave. So since the beginning of the presidential system, you have limits to re-election. So you have a time that he must leave, so he can stay more if it's good enough. And yet, if the president is doing really badly, you also can't remove that person very easily. So the rigidity is something that it's really makes very hard for a country to adjust its directions given changes in circumstances, changes in the opinion of the capacity that the president has to have enough support, the competence that he has on economic and political and military issues, all sorts of things. So you have a situation where the political the political class does not see the president as a leader anymore, a competent leader or a leader that can promote the proper changes, but yet they must stay there. And this is just reforms that must be passed don't get passed, and that sort of thing. So rigidity is a very bad feature of presidentialism. And of course, in a parliamentary system, you have many have the possibility of calling elections, early elections. So even parliament is dissolved, but you always will have the capacity to appoint the prime minister. Very often you have the capacity to remove the prime minister at any given time, and this allows for a lot more flexibility. So, and the fourth characteristic that I would talk about is the personalism. So, whereas in parliamentary systems, you think of the government as a collective thing, as a collective endeavor, and in presidential systems, it's very easy to equalize the government with the person of the president, and that has all sorts of risks. The loyalty is much more prized than capacity to solve problems and being competent. And this personalism very often increases the polarization that we talked about earlier, and has many other challenges to do anti-corruption and that sort of thing. So you see many problems with presidentialism. So and this is I think is very much current. Shabo was an author that I talked about already, challenged on the coalition part that you mentioned. But even if it's true that presidential countries do have coalitions, these coalitions are not nearly as strong as the coalitions that happen to appear in parliamentary countries, because they get to decide everything. Whereas in presidential systems, these coalitions are very often an exchange of small favors that the president has to have the minimum support so that he can promote his agenda. So it's the nature of the coalitions are very different.
Yes, and also I think like in general, to me, it seems always like institutions that kind of divide power or share power among different persons in the same political body are usually more balanced and come to probably even better decisions. And in presidential systems, you have kind of the president that kind of attracts all the attention, while for me, always what happens in parliaments is actually way more important, because that's really the legislative body. And something I don't really understand is why don't parliaments take more power away from presidents? Because you, like also in your book, say that in most presidential systems the presidents have even more power than, for example, in the US.
It's the president has the immediate ability to name and fire so many people, and he's responsible for executing the budget. And I think that he's able to do a strategy of divide and conquer. So any member of parliament that would try to do that thing, so try to remove powers from the president, would have a hard time, because the president has so many capabilities to provide incentives, let's just say it that way, for the Congress people, that they just feel it's not very realistic. But having said that, I do think that there is a struggle. There is an evolving relationship. So sometimes the president will have a lot of popularity, and he will rely on his popular support to encroach parliament. But sometimes parliaments do stand up to presidents and are able to negotiate to a constitutional bargaining of sorts. Roger Congdon tells about how constitutions evolved more than they were implemented all at once. And this happened more in monarchies than in presidential countries. I think that and I haven't developed this idea very much yet, but I think there's some sort of presidential trap. So because you have to renovate the president every time, it's hard for the repeated games, the iterated games that parliament and the president would play, and that a king and parliament play, to come up with mutually beneficial solutions, which would lead to a gradual increase of parliamentary power. In a presidential system, this is really hard, because the president has a fixed mandate. He has to take all of the benefits that he can in a very short amount of time. So it's hard. And then there comes a new president, and he will want all the power that he can have.
One thing that to me is very important is also the electoral system. So when you say why not parliamentarism, I would say why not proportional representation. So it seems that the balance of power also within parliament is really important. And what is the kind of party landscape in parliament also affects how successful parliamentarism is, I would say, because you see like a parliament where with majoritarian elections, like single seat plurality elections, like we have in the UK, you end up with fewer parties, like bigger parties. And that is compared to a system which is more proportional, like, for example, in Germany, where you have more smaller parties that build a coalition. So one danger I think I see in parliamentary system is when they are combined with majoritarian election, is that it really gives, if you have a majority of one party in parliament, it gives the government a whole lot of power. Do you have any thoughts on that, or because in the book you mention it, but like you don't discuss it much? I'm just curious whether you think just parliamentarism is more important than kind of the electoral system itself.
I do think parliamentarism is more important, and this comes from being from Latin America. So many countries in Latin America do have a proportional representation system, including Brazil, and we see that the perils of presidentialism are still there. There was even a time that some people that make the charge that proportional representation is particularly dangerous in a presidential country. So that, I'm not going into that discussion. I just think that given the history, given the framework that I use for my book, the amount of evidence from the sanity check, if we look at the countries today which are doing best in terms of development, democracy, all sorts of things, are they naturally proportional representation? I don't think so, because you have many countries that are from British colonies, Australia or Canada, and the UK itself has developed tremendously under the majoritarian system. So I'm not saying that I don't like proportional representation. I do like it. I just think that it's not as decisive as we think. I think that it might be harming current parliamentary countries. Yes, I think that it might be harming, but it's not the kind of harm that is unsurmountable. We see that majoritarian countries can still do very well, whereas uh, presidential countries with proportional representation are still struggling a lot to get out of the middle income trap, to consolidate their democracies. So if I take a look at the historical evidence, the statistical evidence, I think that parliamentarism has a lot more going for it than proportional representation. I'm not against that. It wouldn't be my priority.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Because I recently always thought like proportional representation is so important, but I think the next few years will be quite interesting to see how the two different systems also develop, because I'm wondering, in the UK, what's going to happen with the Conservatives, because they really seem to concentrate a lot of power in their hands, and they also have a tendency now to, kind of change the rules of the game. And also on the other side, for example, in Brazil, I'm curious to see what happened, because whether a proportional representation can kind of keep the president in check, But that's kind of maybe another discussion for a later moment. One thing I'm curious is, in development discussions, these fundamental institutional questions, like the form of government, like parliamentarism versus presidentialism, they just don't seem to be a very like central topic. Do you know why that is? Is this more like that development question usually evolve around policies and economic questions rather than political institutional questions?
I, I I agree that they don't happen nearly as much as they should, and I'm still a little bit puzzled as to why they don't. I don't think that they are that threatening. So there are many issues that involve a lot more sensitive topics. You think of anti-corruption. So if you think of many international organizations are directly involved in anti-corruption initiatives, and these initiatives very often will involve some of the leaders, some of the political leaders of the country, and they still think that it's worth to pursue that avenue. So it puzzles me why form of government is not more explored. I think, and then this comes from talking to many people, from seeing that people really don't realize the difference that it makes. People think, oh, maybe parliamentarism is a little bit better than presidentialism. But it's like the metric system for the U.S. Maybe the U.S. should adopt the metric system, but that's not what's holding a country back, right? You wouldn't make adopting the metric system the number one priority that you would have for any single country. And I think that that's what people see about presidentialism, parliamentarism. They just don't realize, or maybe they disagree with my thesis. I'm not saying that I have all of the truth, but I think that they don't realize how large this is.
I would totally agree with that. I think also that because development questions are often kind of researched on by economists, I think the political economy aspect, and especially the political aspect, not even the political economy aspect, but the form of government, the fundamental institutional questions are not talked about enough. And I think we totally agree on this point, that it should have way more space in the international discussion. Even though one thing that is probably tricky, or 2 points even. The first is that bringing about institutional change is hard. So I don't know, like advisors or like the kind of international organizations, they are maybe reluctant to even talk about it because they know it's really hard to bring about change. And also, obviously, the question of a country's kind of sovereignty or non-interference of foreign force. So it's for sure it's kind of also a kind of critical topic, I would say. But definitely, in general, we should see a lot more discussion around it, because I think also the people should know more about these different systems.
I agree with you, the view that the economists don't pay enough attention to this, and I completely agree. And I was thinking of a syllogism the other day, which is funny that people don't make it very often. Economists are very aware that institutions are central to development, right? So since Acemoglu and Robinson published Why Nations Fail, it became mainstream economics. And whereas in political science, people are very aware that presidentialism is very harmful to the political environment. So if we just connect these two and we say, okay, of course, the political environment is very connected to institutions, so they will affect each other. So of course it has to. So if the form of government is as important to the politics of a country as political scientists seem to agree, and if institutions are as important to development as economists seem to agree, then it has to be the case the form of government is very, very important for development. So I think that this little click of communication between political scientists and economists would be enough for people to move a lot more in that direction.
Yeah, for sure. Also, I think even in political science, the public discussion could be much stronger on institutional questions. I think what we kind of see, for example, now in the U.S., also with the related to the electoral law, there is now a huge discussion, but it kind of was hidden a bit under in academic circles before coming really to the public forum. And I think these questions are fundamental. Also, obviously, we see that especially European countries with parliamentary system, but also for me, as I said, proportional representation, which is very important. These two topics, they are pretty well spread in Europe, and we see European countries have developed very fair and yeah, more equitable societies. But at the same time, for example, in African countries, we see that most countries have both a presidential system. Well, yeah, at least many have majoritarian elections, and many also have a presidential system. And I think I can't understand why this is not part of the central discussion.
Yeah, yeah. I'm still puzzled too. And it's you mentioned Africa, and it's remarkable that Botswana, one of the three countries that have been consistently parliamentary, is has been developing the fastest in Africa. So that this doesn't strike out to many people as well. Maybe there's something there. It's something that I'm still puzzled by.
So, what is your hope with your book? I think with your book you wanted to start a discussion on that topic, which I strongly support. What is kind of your hope where this discussion would lead to, or what kind of are the avenues that you know kind of people who are interested in that could go down?
So I would really like to see more research on this. So I think that although we have a lot of evidence for it, we could still do a lot more research on this. So if we compare, and I always like to compare it to democracy, because democracy is something that is so present in everyone's lives. So if we look at the amount of research that we have for democracy compared to parliamentarism is really small. And I think that the size of the effects are comparable. So I would like to see a lot more research. I would like to see more people engaged in trying to promote the sort of legislation, the sort of initiative that would make a country more parliamentary, even if they cannot change the constitution overnight. But just to talk about Parliament in a better light would be already better. We always and Parliament seems to be the punch bag of every democracy in the world. It feels like, oh, people love democracy. If only Parliament wouldn't stand in the way. And then, well, if you love democracy, then you should really love Parliament, even if you don't like a specific member of Parliament, which of course we won't always like all the members of Parliament. That the institution itself should be more protected, should be more promoted. And that's the kind of thing, as you said, I would really like to spark a discussion on this. I wouldn't want to see huge changes happening overnight, but not to discuss this at this point. I feel like, and I feel it's like not discussing climate change. If that's the sort of effect size that I think this has. This is urgent.
Hmm. And sometimes I even think, and like NGOs that are engaged in democracy, like that are fighting for democracy, or even also not discussing it like enough, because
Exactly.
for
Yeah.
me it's like such a central issue,
Exactly.
together
And
with
it's
the electoral law. Yeah, sorry.
of course. No, no, and that's something that I think is even counterproductive, because often these NGOs, they do a great job of promoting democracy and talking about the electoral competition, and then they create this environment. People are tired of authoritarianism, and they go and they give democracy a chance, but they give a flawed kind of democracy, which is presidentialism, a chance, which will have all sorts of problems and very, very often devolves into authoritarianism once more. And this will make people more cynical of democracy in the first place. So I would really think that for the benefit of these NGOs, for these institutions that are promoting democracy in the world, that they would talk about, well, we should really do the one that has worked best in the countries that has been tried.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Yeah, totally agree. So to wrap up the discussion, I'd like to hear, do you have any books or articles that you would strongly recommend on the topic?
So, modesty aside, I really think that my book has a very good general overview. I think that it tries to fill a gap. So, but I aside from that,
Yeah, I can
I
recommend it too, for sure.
thank you. I would recommend William Salinger Parliamentarism, which is a book on the history of thoughts about parliamentarism, and the other one would be The Failure of Presidential Democracy, which is compiled by Juan Lins and Valenzuela, and has many articles there. Those are the two books, if I may. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for sharing those, and I will definitely link to them in the show notes so people can have a look at them. Cool, and also of course to your book. All right, Tiago, thanks a lot for that discussion. It was very interesting to hear your views, and hopefully we can have a follow-up discussion at some later point in time to see how things developed.
Well, anytime. This was great. This was a very good conversation. I really like to follow you, and that podcast is really good. Well, thank you.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Tiago. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please share it with friends or on social media, or leave a review on your preferred podcast platform. It really helps my podcast and my message to be heard. On my website, rulesofthegame.blog, you find a form to give feedback directly back to me, or just send me an email to stefan.keiberts@gmail.com. I would love to hear your comments or suggestions for upcoming episodes. Take care.